Hello, and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear, the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thanks for joining the conversation today. Fashion makes us feel elegant and affluent, creating unique looks that allow people living in crowded societies to set themselves apart in unique ways. But fashion also comes with a huge environmental cost. According to many estimates, 10% of the world's carbon emissions and 20% of wastewater are generated by making, shipping, and selling clothing, much of which ends up in landfills long before the clothing's usefulness is exhausted. A significant portion of clothing purchased in the United States, up to 20%, is not even worn, according to some research. Fashion has become the epitome of the take, make, waste way of life. The American Chemical Society, which is funded by the plastic industry responsible for the rise of the materials that enable fast fashion, claims that the volume of fashion production will grow by another 300% before 2050. It's an unsustainable trajectory, and our society might be buried in its clothing waste. Our guest today is Kurt Kipka, Chief Impact Officer at the Apparel Impact Institute, a nonprofit that's working to reduce the negative environmental and social consequences of the apparel industry. The Apparel Impact Institute created a methodology called Clean by Design that helps textiles and clothing manufacturers identify issues, get funding to trial new strategies, and propagate solutions across the industry. The organization emphasizes the importance of objectively measurable results and transparency about progress towards using less energy, water, and chemicals, as well as reducing waste in the manufacturing process for clothing. In a recent report, taking stock of progress against the roadmap to net zero, the Apparel Impact Institute suggests that the fashion industry must reduce its emissions by more than 50% by 2023 to stay aligned with the goal of preventing warming of more than 1.5 degrees centigrade. Making textiles is responsible for 52% of the industry's emissions. So efficiency improvements could make a huge impact, but the report also says that it is time to embrace novel materials and for a more comprehensive move from coal-powered production to renewable energy in the fashion manufacturing centers around the world, many of which are in Southeast Asia, which is coal-dependent. It's time to strip fashion down and rebuild it on a new model. And we can all participate by making informed purchase decisions and communicating our values to the retailers where we shop. You can learn more about the Apparel Impact Institute at apparelimpact.org. Apparel Impact is all one word, no space, no dash, apparelimpact.org. Now let's get into the conversation. Welcome to the show, Kurt. How are you doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me, Mitch. I really appreciate the time.
Well, thank you. And it's a pleasure to have you here. I want to start off. You're the Chief Impact Officer, which is a fairly new title for the Institute dedicated to making apparel an apparel impact. So tell us about your job and what brought you here.
Sure. So maybe my journey helps explain my job a little bit better than just diving into the role itself. I started my career actually in product sourcing at Target Corporation, where I followed a typical sourcing career path all the way to being a buyer, someone responsible for actually shipping footwear across the world. In that role of being a purchaser, I started to ask questions that kind of led me to be known as the green guy of sorts, which prompted me to be given the opportunity to become the sustainability manager, ultimately start a sustainability team focusing on supply chain at Target Corporation. With that, I became connected with some key stakeholders and individuals who have become actually mentors to me since then. One in particular is Dr. Linda Greer from the Natural Resources Defense Council at the time. We worked together very closely while I was at a large corporation. We hit it off, and I actually joined then the NRDC, or Natural Resources Defense Council, overseeing the types of projects that I now oversee for Apparel Impact Institute that really represent implementation work for environmental improvements on the ground within the apparel sector. And with that, my title now of Chief Impact Officer, which you mentioned is a new title, relatively speaking. When we say impact, it's really focusing on environmental outcomes. And so I like to compare myself to kind of the role of a CFO in some cases, in a sense that when we say we're going to deliver on particular environmental improvements with the initiatives we're taking on, it's my sole responsibility to ensure that that's happening across our organization.
Okay, so you're the one responsible for the externalities that the CFO had been ignoring for all that time.
Well, I wouldn't say that. We actually work quite closely together, recognizing that in a lot of cases, the unlock of finance and capital for the kind of work that we do is one barrier in particular that we can address collectively. And so I actually work very closely with the CFO in that regard, and we work together on ensuring that there's both viable financial outcomes for our organization and the ones that we work with, but also environmental impacts or reductions thereof that are resulting from the work that we take on.
Now, the Apparel Impact Institute has documented the supply chains in several regions to understand water, energy, chemical impacts, all the things that fashion does to the environment. What's the journey that leads from those places to the clothes that we choose from at the store? What are the important steps and their impacts?
Yeah, and I'll try to keep it as simple as possible, but the reality is it's an incredibly opaque supply chain and one that is a handful just to map in of itself. And so many organizations, brands, retailers, and even suppliers included, have a really heavy task on their hands just to know where different goods, products, and inputs to the production process are coming from. In its simplest form, however, we break it down into 4 tiers. The first tier being the origin of materials, the origin of natural resources, for example, like cotton, that would be a part of the end product. From there, we would go to tier 3, or the next tier of production, which is preparing that cotton for becoming a material. In some cases, that can become yarn that's being spun or ginned in the 3rd stage, or the tier 3 as we define it, of the supply chain. From there, it goes to what we refer to as tier 2. And that's where we're taking that yarn that's prepped and turning it into an actual material. From there, that large roll of material, if you can visualize it, becomes shipped or transported to a final location where it's cut and sewn. And that's really what we refer to that stage of production as being the cut and sew stage of production, where it's turned into a shirt, a set of pants, or different apparel products. One thing that's incredibly important to note following those 4 steps is that each one of those can happen in a different location. And so when I talk about the opacity of this supply chain, the idea of each of these steps being shipped, transported, moved around the world really creates a complex web of supply chain mapping, and ultimately a chasing that we need to do in order to identify where the appropriate impacts and measures can be taken in order to drive improvement.
It's really phenomenally complex when you dig into our supply chains, but particularly around clothing. Stuff might move back and forth even between locations. How, and I know this is a big question, but how could we reorganize the supply chain to reduce the emissions associated with each of those steps and all of the transportation that's built into the process? Can we put them in one place?
The easy answer is more regional production. The reality is that getting from point A, where we stand now, to point B, a big part of what AII does is some scenario planning and mapping along the realities of how long it's going to take, even in a world where policies, engagement, and practices are aligned to drive more regional production. I do truly think that that is the future state of where this sector, and perhaps a lot of industry, needs to go, is more localized production processes. But in the meantime, we recognize that there are barriers that we can address in the existing format that help to set that industry up for future success, bringing certain production processes closer together or vertically integrating certain processes in a way that not only reduces that transit time and that opacity, but also to drive environmental improvements based on more cohesive production processes.
Now, you reported that greenhouse gas emissions intensity of raw materials has remained pretty constant over the years, and that 52% of the industry's impact is related to those materials. So it's kind of fixed. It hasn't changed a lot. What are the most important transitions we can make in the process of preparation and production of the actual textiles? Is there a big savings to be made there?
Absolutely. And that's probably where I see the biggest opportunity between now and where a lot of players in the industry have set targets for 2030. And that is focusing on that area of the supply chain. If you refer back to the way that I mapped this out previously, what we refer to as tier 2 of the supply chain. So one step further back than a typical buyer, brand, retailer might have is at that material production. It's at this stage where there's heavy water and a heavy heat use in the production of those materials. And with that comes significant opportunities for improvement, many of which have been largely untapped for years. And that's where AII and our programming has historically played. In many cases, just addressing low-hanging fruit improvements like prompting energy efficiency. However, it's at that stage of production where there's also opportunities for incorporating renewable energy transition for the electricity that's being used, but then more specifically focusing on thermal energy needs where there's heat necessary in production, identifying where we can reduce the heat demand that's required for those processes, or even remove it altogether with innovative dry processing or low heat processing interventions or production processes that we could put into play.
Does that suggest that the main move would be away from fossil fuel-based materials that require a lot of heat in order to produce in the first place?
Yeah, and that really represents kind of the way that we break down the efforts that we participate in across the supply chain. There's both fossil fuels as an input to materials, that is the feedstock that's going into material production, but then also the production itself, which in many cases, coal-fired boilers are still very readily used across the industry. And where coal is not being used, in most cases, the transition has been made to gas.
Right.
Now, within our work, we're starting to trace opportunities to either electrify those boilers in some cases, building up business cases wherever it's needed or even possible. Biomass and biofuels can play a role, but that comes with trade-offs as well. So actually a big part of what our organization is working on right now is mapping that thermal energy transition, which viably could happen within key regions based on infrastructure, based on grid, and ultimately the abilities that suppliers in those regions can have to make that transition.
Now, we're talking in large part about Asia, which has grown in dominance by cutting the cost of production. Is there the capital and the will to make the necessary investments in Asia to make this transition while preserving the affordability of our clothes?
You really nailed it on the head. The capital, yes, the capital is there. There's no shortage of funding, finance available. It's connecting that capital, those funds, with the will and ultimately the business case for deploying of those funds. And that's kind of the sweet spot which AI has found ourselves in, identifying good projects that are fund worthy or worth a capital investment, and then ultimately trying to drive business friendly solutions in the form of business to business commitments and engagement that gives that production facility the confidence that, or even the bank, the confidence that this is a good loan based on a commitment or a point of reference, or even a guarantee in some cases that a brand or retailer can have that this is a long range plan, because we start to look at longer term investments that are needed in this supply chain. And in many cases, that supplier, that manufacturer is looking out 6 to 12 months ahead and really just looking to ensure that they're keeping their lights on in most cases. Yeah. And when we start to look at 10 to 15-year horizons for some of these investments, there really is a shared benefit that needs to be accounted for across the banks, even the development banks and the apparel retailers and brands who are bringing this work forward based on the aspirations that they've set for themselves, and rightfully so, to be more conscious of how those goods are being produced.
So are the labels funding the Clean by Design program where you are working to create that greener supply chain?
Yeah, when it comes to environmental improvements, we've seen a significant uptick in brands and retailers who are willing to contribute to those efforts. Typically, though, it's been on the part of consulting and management practices. The actual investment historically has fallen on the supplier themselves. And so you can imagine, and rightfully so, that those suppliers and manufacturers have a right and a reason to question, why does this fall solely on me? How can we provide some shared experience or some shared responsibility in these long-term interventions that ultimately will benefit the industry as a whole? And so what AII has historically done is facilitated the consulting, the road mapping, the target setting for our brand partners, but also supplier partners that we work with. And then we identify where projects within those action plans of achieving a target can be fundable. And that's where we can layer in some of the funding, the finance and bank interest in seeing some of these longer term aspirations come to fruition.
Now, the other thing about the low-cost production methodology is an equity question. 2% of the world's 75 million clothing factory workers earn a living wage at this point. Do you see these organizations really ready to step up, both to make the workplace more equitable and safe?
I think it's a need. And actually, when we look at the work historically done by our team, by our organization, we've been fairly purposeful in defining the scope of what we do solely on environmental impacts. What we recognize, though, is that siloed view is not going to get the necessary change that's needed for this industry. And so we can very simply look at environmental improvements like reducing the heat needed for manufacturing as improving the workplace environment for the workforce across this industry. But taking that one step further, those environmental improvements are also reducing energy needs from the grid itself, providing more consistent energy in the regions where we're deploying this work. And then on the water side, ensuring that effluent is effectively treated within this industry is directly affecting the communities where the work is being done. And so we're on an ongoing basis building that gap or filling that gap rather between what has historically been a very separated and purposely separated set of activities on environment and social indicators. And we look to partners within this industry for collaboration on where we can influence and provide support to those social labor work aspects of the industry that are taking shape.
So again, we're kind of back to the idea of externalities. A lot of the things that we have purposely pushed aside in order to focus on one aspect of the supply chain now need to be taken into consideration as a whole. You end the use of coal-fired boilers. That improves local air quality and certainly the quality of the air within the production facility. But then, the grid benefits and so forth, all of that we need to think about in order to achieve the lower cost that we continue to want to see our clothes sold at.
Yeah, and what you're addressing also is kind of a controversial topic within this industry altogether, and that is the role of fast fashion or the reliance on low-cost clothing within this industry that I guess even as a consumer, I've continually seen the quality of clothing production decrease over time based on those low-cost aspirations. It's more of a throwaway culture, which I think that there would be some great benefit if we were to slow perhaps the buying processes within this industry, which, as you can imagine, becomes a bit controversial when you look at a market approach to building the industry as it is. But ultimately, I do think that we're at a bit of an inflection point, both as an industry and perhaps as a society, if you want to go that far, in terms of our buying practices and what that means for an industry such as fashion, where speed has become very much the norm, low cost has become very much the norm, and ultimately the externalities that has.
Well, the just-in-time way that we make and use everything needs to change. I want to take a quick commercial break and come right back and talk more. Now let's get back to the conversation with the Chief Impact Officer of the Apparel Impact Institute, Kurt Kipka. So, Kurt, following on what we were just talking about, do you see the fashion industry as potentially being ready to sell less and more durable clothing and potentially build in more services like local mending and tailoring to bring some of the production closer to the consumer?
Yeah, I think there are clear signs, both in terms of the brands or the industry taking a part in that high durability repair concept, but then also on the government side, we're seeing expectations increase around or across Europe rather fairly significantly about the durability and expectations that would be applied to goods and services within that region in particular. And you could expect that might expand to other regions like the US and Asia as well. But coming back to the industries or areas of the industry where this is already starting to take shape, you're seeing a lot of uptick, or in fact, we're seeing a lot of uptake in the outdoor industry in particular, where there's goods and services that are ultimately being built for long-term durability. Someone wants to buy a parka or a jacket and have that last 10, 20 years, and it's important that the products are set up to do so. And with that, you're seeing an investment by a number of those outdoor brands and retailers, both in terms of ensuring that there's quality and durable products being brought forward, but also that those repair services, exchange services, take-back services are all being incorporated into the way that they're doing business. What I do think still remains to be seen, and this is the gap for some of the fashion or faster fashion retailers, is the appropriate business mechanism, or the business case rather, for ensuring that if we're taking back, if we're repairing, that there's a business model that is going to support that. And there's a number of different levers ultimately that perhaps could be another conversation we get into, that that would allow for that to happen, both in terms of government intervention and supply chain intervention that could allow for that to happen. But we're seeing that increase overall. The momentum, I think, is building, but I think it could be faster, to be honest.
Part of I mean, rather than regulate this, which I think everybody would have a difficult time with, from the consumer to the manufacturer being told what to do, does the industry need to embrace an ethos of durability and communicate that as one of the key selling points to consumers? Should we be talking more about the fact that, I bought outdoor clothing in 1988 that I still have because it was well made? Is that values-based change something that the industry is really actively discussing?
I think in pockets, yes. And I think that consumers have a lot to do with this, that there is a consumer base that's growing, and it is growing in the expectations that it has of clothing and in product durability overall. Meanwhile, there's also a growing consumer base that is looking for just-in-time fashion, just-in-time customization of products that actually flies somewhat in the face of these concepts of durability and long-standing products that people are buying. And so on a personal level, I love to see the industry continuing to dive into this and to grow the durability and quality of products and that bubble of the industry overall. The reality is that there's still an incredibly huge portion of the supply chain and of the products being sold that are low cost and I would say relatively lower quality than one might expect for something that's going to last from the 1980s to now, in the way that we might view something like an outdoor parcel.
Well, I mean, going all the way to the labels, could they be making their retail centers a repair and reuse and sharing center as well? Not just, you go there to buy stuff and then throw that away, but that becomes the hub for your fashion life.
I do think that gets to kind of this future state of where the industry could or should be going. And in fact, that would be my vision for this industry, that we have these hubs, not only for apparel, but for all products, that are take-back centers, ultimately feeding the supply of product back into a circular, which is a buzzword within this industry today, but a recyclable supply chain, bringing those goods and inputs right back into the supply chain where they came from, and doing that on a local basis. So ultimately, if I were to paint a picture of a perfect industry, it would look something like that. And ultimately, that's something that we can work towards. And as of right now, the biggest challenge is just getting those products, goods, and services and feeding them into any supply chain. And so there are baby steps that can be taken on a path to getting towards that vision of a future model.
Well, how does AII use the Fashion Climate Fund to instigate some of those changes? Are there programs? I know most of this is focused on the supply chain side, but where are you putting your money to work right now?
Yeah, thanks for asking. The Fashion Climate Fund is a really exciting new fund that we announced about a year and a half ago now, based on the interests of a number of key players in this industry, or stakeholders in this industry, to begin looking longer term in nature with the kind of investments that they're making in the supplier base. Having been conducting implementation work on the ground in this industry, One thing that has really hindered or slowed the progress, even of brands in this industry, to make meaningful progress with their suppliers is a short-term nature of the types of relationships they may have with a facility or with a given project. Even grant funding for projects can be something around 3 years in nature. Well, when we're looking at targets within this industry, looking out to 2030 to 2050, the reality is that there are some interventions that we can fund and that we can deploy within the industry that, with a longer term view, a longer pipeline of those activities, that we feel that we can be driving more scaled impact. And that's what the Fashion Climate Fund ultimately seeks to do, to aggregate funding of like-minded organizations who have a vested interest in achieving, in most cases, science-based targets that they've set for themselves, recognizing that there's not a go-it-alone strategy that I've seen that can be proven to be successful. So this aggregated model is one that puts our team and our organization kind of in the middle of identifying quality, value-added solutions for the industry with a longer trajectory out to 2030. And so a big part of my role, in fact, is playing this kind of centerpiece between the Fashion Climate Fund and a deployment mechanism we've created called the Climate Solutions Portfolio. That is a portfolio of projects, technologies, equipment, ultimately, that we're actively seeking to build that have validated, proven impacts within the apparel supply chain in order to decrease carbon that's being used in production. And I am a part of and work with an advisory council that looks at the effectiveness, reach, and scale of the types of projects, equipment, and solutions that the industry has to kind of sort through on this path of decarbonization. And that ultimately becomes the output of this Fashion Climate Fund, is a number of different projects and solutions that come through the Climate Solutions Portfolio, where we can layer on grant funding, where we can provide additional research where it's needed most, driving the potential impact with a dollar in, carbon reduction out mentality of the way that we're doing the work.
Now, I was going through some of the Clean by Design programs, and it seems like they aim for, let me put it, modest gains, between 10 and 20% less energy use, between 20 and 30% less water use. That doesn't sound like we get to 2030 goals, which require roughly a 50 to 55% reduction in emissions, which energy is associated with. How do we stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade and stay well dressed?
You're exactly right that Clean by Design and programs like it historically have looked at low-hanging fruit or very clear efficiency gains from production, beginning to look at more sophisticated solutions like layering on renewable energy, solar PV installation, as the market has made it a more lucrative or clear business case for deployment. The reality is that we need to move beyond low-hanging fruit with the kind of work that we're doing. And that really is represented in the work that we're doing around the Fashion Climate Fund. Whereas a program like Clean by Design really focused on being kind of a gateway to more sophisticated solutions. We're bridging that gap now within the programs and the types of interventions that we're bringing forward, looking longer term in nature.
Are the prospects for 50% improvement by 2030 or 2032 good?
It's there, I will say that. And I would actually bring it back to your point earlier about funding and will. And some of the barriers that exist in this industry are funding, paying for these projects, mapping a business case for some of these projects, ensuring that there's a clear path to not only the impact reductions, the carbon reductions, I'll try to lose the impact terminology here, the carbon reductions, but then also the return on investment from a financial standpoint, which is a key part of what our organization aims to do, not just providing validation of this particular project is going to save you X amount of carbon, but it's also going to allow you to pay for it over time with the savings or with the expectations that you might have for that investment as well. So the prospects are absolutely there. And in fact, even on the energy efficiency side of the equation, I still have yet to tap out that as a viable path to that 50% reduction. There is it's actually what's drawn me to this work. There's an endless amount of efficiencies to be gained in the production process simply with looking at how production is being done on a macro level. There are pockets and sites that are doing an amazing job at being efficient. The industry as a whole is incredibly inefficient.
Well, William S. Gibson put it well. The future's already here. It's just very unevenly distributed. But
exactly.
We are talking about an industry whose supply chain is shipping dependent. And of course, if sea level rises even a foot and a half in many places, that will completely disrupt their supply chain. So does the industry, and this goes to the question of Will, get that they have to reduce their impact in order to avoid having their business completely disrupted? If they can't change, do they recognize they're living on borrowed time?
I think that recognition is there for many leaders in this industry, or many of the organizations who would position themselves as a leader in this industry. And I can even trace my own personal story to this recognition dating back to 15 years ago when I first started taking an interest in this concept of sustainability as it relates to supply chain. There is a recognition that the world is changing, and that with that, the models that have gotten us to where we are today within this sector are not necessarily going to be quote unquote sustainable in the future state of this industry. The challenge, I think, though, is what to do now with that realization. And part of, I would love to say, the argument for working with an organization like ours is the ability to begin looking at some of that scenario planning in a collective fashion, recognizing that one brand deciding to take a particular path may not change the industry as a whole, but a set of 10, 15, 20 of the leading organizations accounting for a large volume of this industry, working towards mutually beneficial solutions for the sector going forward, that's where we can start to tip the scale a little bit in terms of where this industry needs to go in order to truly be sustainable in nature.
Now, one of the things that you emphasize is the importance of third-party validation or certification of the work. What labels, what certifications should shoppers be looking for, or retailers when they're thinking about what to stock?
Yeah, there's a number of labels out there. The Ecotex label, and actually, I would be a little bit weary of claims. Certifications can be helpful on certain products, organically certified, Ecotex certified, Blue Sign produced are a couple of the terms that are thrown out in this industry. What I would be a little bit weary of is carbon neutral, climate positive, things that are a little more opaque that may not be clear for the consumer. Ultimately, though, what I would really look for is quality products, and I would even look towards the brand itself, if at all possible, beginning to look at a brand's website and look at what type of practices they put into place, because ultimately that's what drives my buying practices. I have the privilege to know some of these brands quite well and know their supply chains quite well. And in a way, you can almost have a default buying mechanism put in place that knows that at least this brand's making an effort. They're having an attempt. They've got the right policies and procedures in place to ensure that they're doing good work within their supply chain. But as far as labels are concerned, it's still perhaps a white space opportunity for this industry to put forth something along the lines of a nutrition label, so to speak, on products that would allow the buyer to make a more informed decision.
Well, I think the story of our clothing is something that is a huge opportunity in terms of engaging people, because we also want to tell our own stories. Where this came from. It was made by somebody like this. It has this material. And going one step past the certification, what materials should a shopper be looking for if they want to reduce their impact?
It really varies, to be very honest with you. Natural products are a positive. I would say the use of cotton, organic cotton, big pluses. Recycled materials are incredibly important. We're seeing, not just in this industry, but the proliferation of plastics or petro-based materials being incorporated into what we work with on a day-to-day basis. That can be of great concern. But at the same time, taking a look at the origins of those materials, but then also the makeup of those materials is incredibly important as well.
Are there 3 or 4 questions that you ask before you pull something off the rack and decide to buy it?
To be honest with you, I don't buy a whole lot. And
Well,
it's
okay, so
probably
you're
a result
reducing.
of my
That's a good
work.
thing. That's a good thing.
But yes, and I mentioned it as well that I feel, I'm kind of in the middle of this industry, for example, and so I know a number of organizations that I trust ultimately with the buying practices that I put forward, and so I don't buy a whole lot. But I'll say outside of this industry, I do actually go to websites of some of the manufacturers, some of the brands that exist in other sectors like electronics or home goods, in order to make that assessment, because ultimately there isn't a silver bullet, so to speak, from a labeling standpoint on the environmental side of the equation that's going to give me the confidence, not just from an environmental impacts of production standpoint, but to the point you made earlier about quality and durability. That's probably my chief concern as well when it comes to the products that I'm buying, is that they're going to last for the time frame that I expect them to.
And really, that comes down to the reviews by the other people who have purchased it. Did it last? So again, tying in everybody rather than taking just one narrow view of this industry is the key to being a better fashion shopper.
I agree. You said it well.
So Kurt, this is
Yes.
great advice. How can folks follow both your work and what the Apparel Impact Institute does?
I appreciate you asking. We're on all social channels. We have a really great website that's about to undergo a refresh with some really fun, I guess from a nerd like me standpoint, fun reports. It's for anyone who's looking to learn more about that clothing journey, which you described. It's all out there, where the impacts come from, where the product is made, how it's made. Those can all be found on our website. And then, of course, I'm on social media. I'm at Kurt Kipka on Twitter, and then on LinkedIn as well. I'm happy to be connected with your listeners or anyone interested in this kind of journey that the fashion and apparel sector is taking.
Well, it's going to be a long and important journey, and I hope folks connect with you. Thanks, Kurt, very much for spending time with us today.
Thank you, Mitch. My pleasure.
That was my conversation with Kurt Kipka. He's the Chief Impact Officer at the Apparel Impact Institute, and you can learn more about the organization and its work at apparelimpact.org. Apparel Impact is all one word, no space, no dash, apparelimpact.org. Fashion reflects the times, and the speed of product updates and clothing choices, as well as in consumer electronics and automobiles and everything else, are the signature ideas of the early 21st century economy. Having connected the world, we sped it up and encouraged a lot more consumption. And now we can see the consequences in extreme weather, rising costs as supply chains are strained not just by pandemics, but by rising seas, drought that raises the price of natural fibers like organic cotton, and the full gamut of climate change impacts that are really disrupting our lives. And we're seeing only the beginning of that disruption today. So Kurt made an important point, and one I think we need to keep in mind, that there's no single silver bullet solution. A sustainable economy won't be built on one change, like recycling more clothing, though that's an important behavior that we need to embrace as part of a bigger picture. The new, more local economy can allow clothing labels to participate in our lives differently, making their retail outlets a hub for reuse and repair services, maybe adding new experiences like enabling the resale of their clothing, perhaps by offering certified refurbished items that they collect from customers, mend, and then resell, could open new paths to revenue. So today's fast fashion item that costs $10 and is worn 1, 2, or 3 times before being discarded could become a durable piece of clothing that is sold, resold, loaned, or traded in many times, with the fashion label earning revenue at each turn as the facilitator of the experience of shopping for quality, long-lasting clothing. I mean, actually, what we really want is the entertainment of buying stuff. And if we keep buying the same stuff over and over instead of making new stuff all the time, that's a more sustainable outcome. Who knows? We might soon see a reduce, reuse, and recycle-centric fashion industry instead of the take, make, waste model that dominates today. So, of course, we'll keep an eye on this story, folks. Stay tuned. I hope you'll take a moment to share this podcast or any of the more than 440 interviews that we've done on sustainability in your ear with your friends and family. Writing a review on your favorite podcast platform, that is going to make the biggest difference in helping your neighbors find us. Folks, you're the amplifiers that can spread more ideas so we create less waste. So please tell your friends, your family, your coworkers that they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or any other fine purveyors of podcast goodness that they prefer. Thanks for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear, and we will be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.